Our first scripture lesson is from Luke 14, verses 1 through 6. It's the Joseph A. Fitzmyer translation. Once, when Jesus went into the house of a prominent Pharisee to take a meal with him on a Sabbath, and people were watching him closely, there happened to be a man in front of him, afflicted with dropsy. Jesus addressed the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" But they kept silent. So he took hold of the man, healed him, and sent him away. Then he said to them, "Suppose a child or an ox of any one of you falls into a well. Would you not immediately pull it up, even on the Sabbath?" And to this, they could not find an answer. This is our gospel reading. Thanks be to God.
And just as we were talking with Harrison, and in my Friday message, Evangelist Luke very often makes a point to balance the stories about men with the stories about women. So here comes a story more or less similar to what we just heard about the healing of a man with dropsy. And it is about a woman. So it is from Luke 13, 10 through 17. You have the same translation in the bulletin, but this is kind of tweaked by me here and there. Jesus was teaching on a Sabbath in one of the synagogues. And look, a woman was there, afflicted with a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, bent over and unable to straighten up in any way. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said, "Woman, you are rid of your infirmity." And he laid his hands on her. Instantly, she straightened up and glorified God. But the leader of the synagogue, annoyed that Jesus had cured her on the Sabbath, remarked to the people, "There are 6 days when one is to work. On those days come to be cured, but not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord said to him in reply, "Hypocrites! Does not each of you release their ox or ass from the mangers on the Sabbath to lead them off to water? This woman is a daughter of Abraham, and Satan has kept her tied up for 18 long years. Did she not have to be released from that bond even on the Sabbath?" And as he said this, all his opponents were struck with shame, while all the people rejoiced at all the wonderful things he was doing. Dear friends, specifically this biblical passage is close to my heart, I must say. I shared that on my social media, on Facebook, and many of you, I noticed, kind of commented on it all even. 31 years ago in few months, this was the text of my ordination sermon. And I need to explain, in Presbyterian tradition, that is not common thing, like the person who is ordained preaching. But over in my denomination in Czech Republic, and we actually checked that in many other denominations in Europe, that is a common thing. Those who are ordained or installed are preaching the sermon. Sort of programmatic. So you can imagine that preparing for ordination, I knew it was coming in the middle of March that year, so that I would be able to serve communion, for instance, for Easter. I was really hard thinking, what message should I bring? What should I lift up? And I settled on this biblical passage. I preached my programmatic ordination sermon. And I revisited that. I spent substantial time thinking about it back then, and I spent substantial time thinking about it right now. And it was my programmatic sermon because I believed, and I still believe, that faith heals. Faith sets people free. It leads to release and to liberation. I will preach on it now, of course, differently. It's 31 years later, and I am preaching in another language, not to mention another culture. So, but I want to really take seriously what I preached 31 years ago. I'm still convinced that faith is the true force for liberation. Faith of Jesus sets free. And immediately, first thing, I need to speak about liberation from anti-Judaism. There was no need for me to do that in my ordination sermon. I need to explain here because of the deep shared history of tiny, small Protestant minority in my homeland and tiny, small minority of Jews in my homeland. Both minority faiths, both suspect and persecuted. And the history of conversions in both directions to avoid inquisition and religious oppression and violence. There are documented cases of mostly Spanish, but not only Spanish, Jews escaping persecution by Inquisition and joining the denomination of my ancestors. They were actually responsible for translating Hebrew Bible from Hebrew, or at least partly helped them to translate the first Czech translation. You might remember occasionally I carried that big book with me as an illustration. So that's one thing. And then when the Protestants lost their cause for independence of faith, and were crushed by the Austrian Habsburgs and forced to become something they were not, of the Roman Church, there are rumors and legends about at least some of them in certain congregations joining the synagogues rather than becoming worshippers, as they would call it, of idols, the statuary and depictions. Those were the times. I don't approve that fully, but that is the situation. So I did not have the reason back then to lift up that this passage is not anti-Judaistic or anti-Semitic. Here in America, and in these days, it needs to be lifted up. Arguments in the Synoptic Gospels are not anti-Jewish, and absolutely they are not anti-Semitic. Firstly, Jesus was a Jew and had an argument about the direction and shape and form of their shared faith. And his disciples at the time of composition of this gospel were still part of Judaism. one of the branches, if you wish, actually quite close to Pharisees at that time. That is the reason for so many arguments in the Bible between disciples of Jesus and Pharisees. We don't have arguments with distant strangers, but we argue with those who are close to us and for whom we care. So that is the background. And also, if you pay attention to these arguments which were there in those two passages about the healings on Sabbath day, if you pay attention to those arguments, they are still Jewish in their nature. That might be one of the reasons why they sound so strange to us. Why is it appropriate to heal on a Sabbath day is the question. And Jesus makes arguments which I would say every rabbi might recognize. They are similar to those made in Talmud, which would be written after the Gospels. And you might not know it, but both arguments Jesus is lifting up about rescuing a farm animal from a well and giving farm animals to drink or feeding them, even on Sabbath day, perhaps are distant and indirect, but are references of the Torah, the most holy part of the Hebrew Bible, the law of Moses from Exodus and Deuteronomy. To sum it up, it is not anti-Judaism, but a Jewish argument within the Judaism and about the shape and form and meaning of boundaries of their shared faith. Next, I want to talk about liberation of women. That's my main theme here. In the YouTube Friday message and in our children message, we talked about Luke intentionally and programmatically including and lifting up women. In our story, it is made even more explicit because Jesus called the afflicted woman to the center of that synagogue. Imagine that within the context of Orthodox Judaism, if you have any kind of exposure to them. Unthinkable. I know European medieval synagogues influenced by Orthodox Judaism. Women were separated and kept behind perforated walls. For instance, in Prague, there is a famous synagogue, Old New Synagogue, which goes back to the 13th century, the beginning of the 13th century. And, men were inside, and there was kind of like hallways all around with holes in the walls, and that was the place for women to sit and to listen. Later, from Enlightenment forward, women were allowed in these parts of the Judaism on a balcony. But being in the center, being called to the center of synagogue? No way. It was not only an argument, therefore, about the Sabbath day. It is, at the same time, an argument about the role of women in our faith, in our shared faith, in radical departure from patriarchal customs which put women behind walls and on balconies. Jesus invites and places women in the center of worship space, especially those afflicted. And Luke enthusiastically agreed. And it is refreshing to see these days women rabbis in the city. I met a number of them. And similarly discouraging and sad state of affairs within the Christianity, completely separated now from synagogues, from Judaism, with some Christian denominations who exclude women from ministry and from full participation in faith. To name those most obvious, of course, Roman Church and Orthodox churches of all different stripes and dots on them. But even Protestant fundamentalists, just recently Southern Baptists passing the law that the congregations will be excluded if they had women ministers. And I'm not mentioning those who call themselves Presbyterians. They offer lip service to Calvin, but exist far from the spirit of Swiss Reformation, Reform tradition, from ethos of Presbyterian theology. That maxim goes, Ecclesia reformata semper reformanda est. Reformed church is always reforming. That was one of the liberation of women for full participation in worship. And that is always more than just about worship, friends. It goes definitely further. That's a token. Behind it is acknowledgement, recognition, allowance of women, the same attention, the same divine grace. Of course, they have it by definition from God. We have no control over it. But there are churches who are trying to control it through these gimmicks. Divine grace is exuberant and covers everyone. And Luke did know it because he was a faithful follower of Jesus. And that was also the argument of liberation which is present in our passage. And that leads to the liberation from that affliction. Probably a thing which immediately captures our attention. The Bible presents it in a highly mythological language. We meet there a personified illness. That illness is behaving like a person there. And that woman was crippled by a spirit, we are told, of infirmity. And then twice it appears in the text, bound by Satan. So exorcism was in place. That's highly mythological language. Our modern times would probably speak about idiopathic kyphosis or scoliosis. Idiopathic means that of unknown sources. Perhaps psychogenic kyphosis or scoliosis, that it is simply generated by her mind. An older terminology, kind of offensive and now being abandoned, is scoliosis or kyphosis hysterica. But friends, frankly, I actually like that biblical, mythical worldview and the way of talking about it, the terminology, better. I'm not giving up the medicine, and I have medical professionals in my family all around me. But I like this terminology better in the Bible because if we only a little bit demythologize that statement, take away a little bit of that mythology there, that supernatural, then that, like, for instance, not imagining the demons like there, or Satan like from the fairy tales. That's what I mean. Unlike the modern medical language, this mythical language, at the same time, if we put aside this kind of exuberant visions of those demons or Satans, that mythical language tells us something important. Something important. She was kept hostage. by outside forces. That's my way of demythologizing it. She was kept hostage by outside forces. Those forces were crippling her. Now, perhaps she was kept down by an overbearing parents or by mother-in-law. In that time and space, wherever she married or was married, the oldest matriarch would have all the control over the females of that household, or by expectation put on her by that patriarchal society. That's the psychologizing that. But we know such people in our lives, don't we? Bend down figuratively or even literally. And not only by families and a society, and here I can make a sidetrack a little bit, just how many therapists do we have in New York City? And those therapists are helping us to deal with those overbearing parents, say, and all these expectations. But not only families, society and culture. Think about, expectations just starting with something which can afflict your body, and staying within the female realm, high heels, ladies, high heels. How pleasant are they? Aren't they mutating and harming our very feet? Or Chinese deforming feet, the tradition that small feet is, and so the little girls were bound to the point that, or those giraffe necks for the beauty reasons. Do you know them? Like they put those bronze or whatever it is, brass rings around the necks to pull them out and causing serious problems to those women. Language, it is concerning. Those are the forces which are binding us down. Outside cultural forces crippling specifically and more women than men. But there are also social circumstances like employment, occupational diseases, ancient and modern. Ancient blacksmiths were poisoned by lead and arsenic, and that is why Hephaestus, God Hephaestus, is limping. Or at least that is the theory of that. Or mercury poisoning for medieval hatters. Mad Hatter, that's here. Or medieval spinsters with their arthritis and dystrophies of their hands and fingers as they were twisting those threads all the time. Or radium girls. And up until now, milk girls, being all the time around cows and surrounded with the manure, losing their teeth or, health of their teeth for that reason. And today, wrist arthritis and carpal tunnel for computer people. Or computer vision syndrome. It has a name. And not only physical injuries and disabilities, of course there are many and I mentioned just few, but spiritual and psychological, especially putting extra burden on girls to fulfill expectations and roles imposed on them. Now I have granddaughters, so I pay even closer attention. And they are absolutely imposed from outside. In our family, we try as little as possible. They are imposed from outside, but they are very often deeply internalized. This is what is right for you. This is how it has always been. This is how it should be. That is the language. And the liberation starts when we recognize all these pathological forces, when we name them properly as evil and satanic forces, binding us down, crippling us, stealing our joy of life. And to this comes Jesus and shows that the true divine purpose in our lives is different, and that true faith is and must be the force for liberation and enjoyment of life. And so he embraced her, and she straightened and immediately praised God. Something she definitely did even before, but now she could accompany that with a proper posture, with proper gesture. That was the way they praised God. That's the way they prayed. In our tradition, it is usually this way. In that tradition, it was this way. So she being able to straighten up, she for the first time was able to accompany her praise of the Lord with a proper gesture. Sabbath is the perfect time for it, because the Sabbath was set apart for the enjoyment of life. And here even animals, and we are returning to some of those illustrations there, and you will also recognize why it is there and how it makes reference to something very important, actually to 10 Commandments. If you read 10 Commandments, you will find that the commandment of keeping Sabbath, the day of rest and worship, is accompanied by the list of creatures or entities or beings who are to rest. And among them are these oxes, cows, and domestic animals. Everyone is allowed on that day to enjoy their life. So, dear parents, after 31 years, I preached on this biblical text in English, so that differently than from Czech. But one thing is the same. The true divine faith and the essence of worship was, is, and must be the force for liberation, for lifting up and strengthening up all those who are bent down by whichever affliction, by whichever forces in our families, in our society, in our culture, in our world. We are invited to live in freedom of the children of God. In the Bible, it is that they put children of Abraham. That is their way of speaking about God. And you know that if there is a reference to Abraham, we came across that several Sundays ago. Children of God, and we are encouraged and empowered to make it reality also for people around us.